Well, thanks everyone. Sorry to be a little bit late. It's great to see a great big group on the line here. We are so thrilled. I just want to say, oh my gosh, there's Stewart. And Stewart Sarkozy-Banoczy has joined us today to share a lot about community development finance institutions and how they relate to resilient communities, resilient cities, the things that we care a lot about. So we do want to make a lot of time for that. And it sounds as though, Jonathan, was everyone going to be introducing themselves, or are we going to be using the chat for that?
Using the chat.
Okay.
Beth has modeled it in the chat.
Okay, perfect. So if people wouldn't mind putting your coordinates in the chat, that would be wonderful. And for sure, say hello to one another if you haven't seen each other in a while, at least since the last meeting. And I guess there are a few things that we wanted just to cover from the housekeeping perspective. It's great when people can keep their video on. And, if you are willing to mute yourself when you're not speaking, that would be awesome. And if you are new to ASAP, actually, is there anyone on the line who is new to the American Society of Adaptation Professionals? Because I'd like to just welcome you if this is your first ASAP thing. Chris Smith. Hi, Chris with Headwaters. That's so lovely. We think Headwaters is the best, and we occasionally connect with Patty and really appreciate your work. You recently did some rural work that I was like, holy cow, this is shocking and important. So maybe one day you'll be a speaker on in this meeting. Anybody else who's new? Okay, well, we welcome all comers. We're glad you're here. I may have missed someone who was raising their hand, so sorry if that's the case. Fantastic. So in addition to our welcomes to new folks, I wanted to ask if there's anything new from the perspective of grants.gov, Federal Register, or other finance examples that people are aware of. This is our chance to let people know that there are, in fact, money possibilities to flow into our resilience project. So we have some real experts on the line, and maybe we can just take a couple of minutes here for people to raise their hand if they have anything new. At the very bottom of the agenda, there's a running list. So if it's not on that list, we'd like to hear about it. Yes, Michael, please go ahead. You're the big expert.
Hi, thank you. I was just going to say that one thing, DOE is hosting a public workshop on their draft resilient and efficient codes implementation. It's going to be a funding opportunity. That will be happening actually on Wednesday. So that's a great opportunity from the energy efficiency and resilient energy side of things. On the same line, on the Federal Register, DOE is also looking for information about how to actually set up energy efficiency revolving loan funds, which again, hopefully will focus on the resiliency side of things. That again is an open request for public comment going on right now. On the actual grant side of things, there's actually two, the Clean School Bus, which again is really focused on EVs, but is a great opportunity for potential two-way charging, focusing on resilient microgrids. That is opening up, actually, it may have just opened up. If not, it's going to open up later this month. And last but not least, there's also the RACER, which is another energy efficiency side, but it's another opportunity to fund resilient energy opportunities. But I'll put those all in the agenda, and would be happy to answer any questions you all have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. You always model the way in terms of sharing your knowledge. And there's more knowledge here. Adi.
I just wanted to ask a clarification question, Michael. Is this the RACER opportunity, resilient community for energy resilience or something like that?
I can never remember the acronym, but yes, that's one of the opportunities that I think opened up now about a week or so ago.
Got it. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, well, as these other ideas are coming your way, you can put them in the chat, and if you put them there, we're going to capture them in the notes, or you can put them in the notes. But it's really, there are others who aren't in this meeting today who might come back to this list, and it's just a very generous thing to have it all in one place. All right. Pausing there in case there's anything I'm missing. Great. Well, I'm going to turn it now over to Jonathan. Will you, Jonathan, share something about our last meeting? And before you do, I just want to say Karina French was an incredibly wonderful presenter last time. I learned so much about the really important work she's doing at Wharton and about insurance in general. And it's really wonderful that she broke the ice for all of us now. And we can see that we can be peer leaders and also peer learners through this process. So anyone on the line who's going to be hearing what Stewart has to say today and maybe thinking to themselves, hey, I could be presenting in this group. Yes, you can. And we'll be seeking presenters for the future. And Karina was a great start. So Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, well, I think that was a great kind of segue into this. Last time, as you might have heard, we heard from Karina. Her presentation is up on the notes from last time, and all of the agenda from last time, as well as her presentation, are both linked in today's agenda for your perusal as we go forth. Our meeting resources from last time, other slides will be there as well. And we're excited to see how this conversation goes from e-insurance and other risk-related research to what Stewart will be talking about today. But one thing to note is that the funding and finance group, this group, leadership team is getting together tomorrow at 4 p.m. EST to kind of talk about group goals, strategies, and kind of formalizing the leadership roles going forward. If you'd like to join and talk about, share your ideas, or join the leadership team, contact Liana. Her email address is also in the agenda, and we'll probably put it in the chat as well.
Thanks, Jonathan, and Brianna too. Ned Gardner with NOAA.
Hello, I wanted to make sure people knew about the Build.gov website, which has a summary of all the IIJA funding, and I'm sure it will be updated through time. So I put it in the notes.
Great, Ned, thank you so much. And, Ned has been super helpful to me, helping to see that, I mean, this is not Ned's day job, but that the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, has lots in it that relates to resilience. It's not just that one resilience, whatever, 60 some billion. Every single dollar in there is a resilient dollar. So it's great that all of you can be part of making sure our communities get access to that in a resilient way. Super, thanks, nice update. Okay, so now we are going to be hearing from Stewart, and I think many of you saw Stewart's information in the lead up to this call. Stewart is someone who I've looked up to for, at least 6 years in my own resilience journey. In particular, most recently, he made a profound change happen in the resilience community when he and a couple of friends started up this Resilience 21 initiative, which I don't think he's going to be talking about so much today. But in addition, especially as there was a major transformation in city resilience institutions who were guiding cities, Stewart continued to steer the course and then emerge as a global leader to create and now lead the Resilient Cities Network. So I'm just super grateful to you for doing that, Stewart. And I'm so eager to hear more about both you and CDFIs for the bulk of our conversation here today. If you would be willing to share about a 30-minute presentation, sorry, didn't mean to cut you short there. And then we'd love to have some discussion. And with this group, feel free, all of you, to put things in the chat and maybe even to interrupt Stewart if you wish, but keep in mind that we will have at least 10 minutes for discussion after Stewart has completed his formal presentation. So Stewart, over to you.
Thanks, Joyce, and hi everyone. That was I'm embarrassed. There's no way that you were looking up to me, so I think I was following you in this path. But it's true that, and these are kind of caveats for some of you who I work closely with in other realms. I am the global director for policy and investments at the Resilient Cities Network, but I'm also working with Precari Labs, my company, with lots of other partners and clients. And so because of that, you'll hear me shift a little bit out of various hats because they got overlapped through time and some changes in organizations. And the other caveat is this conversation brings two worlds together for me, which is a bit of a dream state. And I want it to be a discussion because there's parts of this that are still very nascent and feel cutting edge. And then at times you'll think, God, this seems like it's been going on forever. Why haven't we been talking about it? So I have these kind of moments where I swing back and forth. We're like, yay, we're winning. Oh my God, we're so far behind. How come we've been talking about this for the last 10 years? So you'll feel that too, because that's the other caveat from my CDFI background and my resilience background. And they collide in this conversation, but also in some of the very specific tools and partnerships that I'll talk about. So happy to fill that time, but also very, very excited to just have the discussion about how we move various parts of this before I sort of show slides and show the initiatives and sort of tools. Wanted to put that out there because the conversation about how we do more with the kinds of things we've started down this path on, and some of that relates to policy. Every example that was just brought up reminds me of the Resilience 21 Coalition conversations that were happening before the administration got in place, and the guide that we created. I can drop the resilience21.org link in there so you can go look at the 10 big actions. And because that relates a lot to finance, right? It's where the money is flowing. But for the group that came together and has now grown to over 2,000 on our listserv and nearly 600 on our LinkedIn group for Resilience 21, it's a lot about how the funding flows, right? It's not so much what, there's a lot of great what, but there's a bunch of how that we're still working on. And the topic today relates to that because it's a little bit of how do we get some group that worked in a certain fashion working on resilience and vice versa. And that seems to be the common conversation that we're having across agencies with the White House and others to sort of get this stuff to blend together, right? So that's the kind of discussion I hope that we can have today, because it's, I don't want to say it's all about funding and financing, but it is when it comes to policy and storytelling, because those things have to merge. And that's kind of what you'll see a little bit of today. So let me share my slides. And like I said, if we start really getting into discussion, you can interrupt me. I don't have a problem with that. If there's a, this is how I teach my classes as well, right? Like if there's a question right at a certain point, let's get to it. At the end as well, right? Because this is, as I said, somewhat new territory in some ways. So let me jump in. As per usual, I gave it a big, long title of Resilient Community Development, the role of CDFIs in holistic equitable resilience building, because it's hard to describe what I'm talking about sort of in its entirety, because they are sectors that have worked in silos, quite frankly. And a lot of you know this, and we've been trying to bring it together, and I see people nodding their heads, right? So that's the idea here, because ASAP and the funding and financing toolkit and guide and everything is sort of pushing us in this direction of like, let's think more holistically across all fronts, right? And he's moved forward. There we go. Oops. So I'll start with the community development finance sector, and apologies for those that are steeped in this, but it's kind of where we have to start, because the CDFI sector, as in community development financial institutions, is one part of this melding that we're trying to do and the conversation that we're having today. And the sector, for those that don't know, has been around for a while, but continues to be one of those sectors where, like, it took my mom 10 years, honest to God, for her to be able to say, oh, God, now I get what you do. I get what CDFIs are, right? And I mean, literally, I started a CDFI called Forbands Community Fund 20 plus years ago, right? And for the first 10 years, she was like, I'm not really sure what you're doing. So it's the kind of thing where we really want to make sure that we're all kind of speaking the same language. So I'll start with the community development finance sector. And the start of that sector was in the 1980s when we had this sort of burst of revolving loan funds. You'll kind of remember those that came out of the EDA system and lots of other places, SBA, but those loan funds and the kind of cooperative movement and credit unions were really the foundation of what became CDFIs, the Community Development Financial Institutions sector. And what is often misunderstood is that there are CDFIs and then there are certified CDFIs. And I'll talk about that certification in a second through the US Treasury. But what's important is that so many of these CDFIs came out of the sort of formalization of the sector, which really began in 1994 with the Regal Act, which created the Community Development Financial Institution Fund, the CDFI fund at the US Treasury. So kind of as often said in the sector, starting with Birkenstocks and moving to suits over time, right? Very kind of crunchy granola groovy, revolving loan funds and cooperatives in the 80s, and maybe a little bit earlier in the credit union movement, became something that became more and more formalized. And now there are CDFIs that are banks, credit unions, the loan funds of all types, mostly business loan funds, but housing loan funds as well, and then venture capital firms. And they can all be certified CDFIs. They are not all certified. What's pretty amazing is that there are now thousands of CDFIs in the US, including Puerto Rico and Guam, as well as across native communities, and then a handful in UK, Australia, Canada. And I put a little note there because there's actually a movement to create an entire CDFI sector now in the country of Canada in a similar fashion to the way it is in the United States. And that's new just in the last couple of years, actually even just a year. There are a few foundations that were really working with some partners to try and do that. There were community development organizations, but not necessarily kind of this archetype that we've seen grow out of this movement. And I said I started a CDFI called Four-Bands Community Fund. I now serve on the board. When I started that, there were only 4 native CDFIs, and there's now over 100, and there's 70 some that are certified. So that movement since, that was 1999, has grown exponentially, and we've seen the real change because in the case of where I started mine, that was a place where there was very little economic dollar turnover at all, and definitely no native owned businesses, very little home ownership, access to capital was very diminished. And there are still places like that, but it's come a long ways in the last 20 years. So the certification, when it became formalized after 1994, these bullets that you see there are the certification kind of parameters. There's a very detailed application process. You can get grants from the CDFI fund ahead of time to create your CDFI. And there are training programs. My second organization, which was also a CDFI, but an intermediary, did lots and lots of trainings for CDFIs. In that case, it was just for native CDFIs and the creation of them. But running institutions or founding institutions through getting to the point of being able to pass each of these 7 bullets that you see here. And what's important is that the board representation and the fact that it has a primary mission of community development really sort of hit home with the kinds of institutions that have been created over time, because these institutions have already a low to moderate income kind of focus. They have equity as a focus, and then they have these various economic, housing, etc. kind of targets, community facilities included in there, and lots of other training and technical assistance that they provide to their communities. So you can imagine many of them, including the one that I was involved with and those that I helped create over time when I was with the second institution, really become an anchor inside the community. In this case, the Native nations that had these really kind of spun out from there, working with the tribe, and that was a very different scenario. But you can also see them in various neighborhoods in cities and other rural communities in Puerto Rico and other places. So If they are able to pass those tests, then they become US Treasury CDFI funds certified, which then opens them up to what are called financial assistance dollars, which is different than the technical assistance dollars they get, which are more grant-based funds to get them going. So on this one slide, I'm basically giving you both the history and the kind of present status of an entire sector that now exists, that began loosely in the 80s, formalized starting in 1994 with the Regal Act, and over time has grown and grown and grown and become much, much more sophisticated. The CDFI fund itself and the sector, including people that I worked with in the programs I'm going to describe in a second, really became full of associations and networks around the venture capital groups, around the community development banks. Inclusive is the association of the community development credit unions, for instance, really robust network. And there's multiple networks. Opportunity Finance Network, who I work very closely with, still, they are the association of all CDFIs. And so there's an overlap from those networks, but OFN, as it's called in short, really is the sort of home for the community development sector, both certified and uncertified, actually. And they have an annual conference, and there's all kinds of trainings. There's some trainings coming up, webinars coming up, as a matter of fact, that are going to have some focus on resilience and housing, for instance, and other sectors. So really important institution in this framework of community development meets resilience. And that's really where, to some extent, I've been spending my time. I want to make sure if there's anybody wanting to interrupt in terms of questions. Yes, yes. And I should have said part of the reason that I ended up finding out about the CDFI world is that, having lived in Germany 3 different times, that whole movement about credit unions and the kind of origins that kind of came to the US and then went back there. So, and interestingly enough, in my Resilient Cities work, the Colombian government and some of the cities wanted special trainings on CDFIs because, in fact, their kind of structures in the country fit well with a kind of CDFI model. Nothing has yet come of that, but like other places in the world, there's definitely the ability to kind of spin and shift towards this model. And for sure, credit unions, in fact, Bilbao, where I did some studies under the Resilient Cities work, considers itself the home of cooperatives in the way that we have learned from them over the last couple hundred years, as a matter of fact. Adi, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, are there any statistics on the breakdown in the CDFIs and, say, urban versus rural communities? Maybe you covered that and I missed it.
No, I didn't. And that's a kind of stat I could put up here. By far, most of the CDFIs are revolving loan funds. I did mention that. And of them, most of them are business loan funds. And then you've got credit unions as the next kind of batch, and then banks, and then the venture capital, right? They're per capita, they're spread kind of evenly, if you will. But as you can imagine, there's many more in urban areas. In fact, you have very specialized CDFIs in urban areas. Sometimes you will get some that are almost just neighborhood focused, or around a minority group or an immigrant group mixed with, a certain sector, right? Business. So there are what I would call very niche CDFIs, and part of the Birkenstocks to suits thing is that there are also now very big national CDFIs who do work all over the country, who began as, say, just a California CDFI. Some of my partners that I've worked with in the past started as local CDFIs, then branched out to the state, then started doing work across the country. Things like, and I won't go into details on this, but the New Markets Tax Credit Program allowed CDFIs to partner with each other all over the country and move much bigger dollars and investors in. The growth of the social impact bond movement, starting kind of 2005 through 10, also brought in CDFIs to another conversation. They unfortunately were not the target of things like opportunity zones. And in my opinion, that was one major failure among others of the opportunity zones, because the CDFIs could have been an incredible lever if just applied directly through that lens, because of the low to moderate income view and the real equity lens that CDFIs use. So if you look at them, they look disparate, but then you kind of look per capita, and the fact that there are 100 native CDFIs doesn't cover native communities, but there are some bigger intermediaries coming around. One I work with directly, and I'll talk about later, is the Indian Fund, which is part of Indian Collective. Really trying to do deep work that has a decolonization and development side to it, as well as the kind of traditional CDFI kind of view on things. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Stewart. Are there any agriculture-focused CDFIs?
There are, and there's even a one called Akiptan, which is a native ag-focused intermediary CDFI that's been around for the last 4 or 5 years, and they're doing amazing stuff. They spun out of the Intertribal Ag Council, but there are also smaller and larger ones throughout the country. And there's some CDFIs, rightly so, in urban areas, for instance, who've started to kind of accentuate what they're doing by adding urban ag issues to what they fund and what they do training on.
Thank you.
Yep.
And Stewart, just a process check. You're about halfway through, a little over, just so you know.
Yep. Okay. Yep. So I wanted to spend, even though it's one slide, I wanted to spend some good time on, like, here's what the CDFI sector is, because the rest of this we could talk about for days, and as we talk about the tools and move into this. But here's where the CDFIs, the community development financial sector broadly, globally, because the ISO work globally with the Resilient Cities Network. And some of our new efforts are really kind of going to resilience size and CDFI size in some ways, those worlds together in a global context in some of the cities that we're working in. And here's why. We are out of balance. We are tending to be in a recovery phase a lot. We have cascading effects from shocks and stresses. COVID showed this to us. I think a lot of people woke up to resilience during COVID. We certainly got, in all fronts, busier during COVID, despite shutdowns, because people began to say, wait a minute, look at how interconnected these systems are. Yes, right? Still working on my mom, but we're getting there. So what we're trying to do is look at what we call resilience dividends, which are A, better outcomes from projects, generally speaking, and B, adding co-benefits, or what I like to now call cascading benefits, because why not have cascading benefits if we can have cascading negative effects, right? So if we do as much as we can in the recovery and resilience sense, can we not create cascading benefits instead of cascading effects? And all of this balanced on what we call a return on the resilience value, the RRV, with those qualities that you see there under the fulcrum, right? How do we get ourselves to at least tipping this thing back to the middle, which is a bit of a dream, but how do we start moving this, right? And the idea is we need all sectors involved, and that became how we started talking about this resilience assessment tool, which I'm going to talk about very briefly. I can't go into detail, but I can share it with you, and we can talk further about it. But basically, we started talking about the creation of some kind of resilience meets community development sector back in 2016 really, but 2017 and 2018, right during the Opportunity Finance Network conference. The hurricanes were hitting in the Caribbean. Maria then hit Puerto Rico. It was all kind of coming up. It was like another version of COVID, right? People started saying, God, why weren't we better prepared from the last one? I worked on the Hurricane Sandy task force, and I can't tell you how many times that phrase was uttered. Why didn't we fix that last time? I worked on post-Katrina stuff, right? Same set of conversations after that. So this is where the community development finance sector, both for itself and its partners and funders, but also for its borrowers, could say, why don't we start to get ahead of this? So we started working on this with the Opportunity Finance Network and a set of CDFIs and a much broader technical advisory committee, which included banks, philanthropy, impact investors, sustainable finance folks, some of them global, and we sort of brought together this whole universe. And then we decided, after Resilient Cities Network became what it is now, after 100 Resilient Cities, and some of the work moved over to Opportunity Finance Network, sparing you the gory details, but we then narrowed down to say, let's start with CDFIs. Let's not get too distracted by the other sectors, though we know, and our technical advisory committee kept reminding us, we know there's lots of sectors we can talk to about this tool and these principles, but let's use the CDFIs as an example. And that was very fruitful. So using the small group that you see there, Coastal Enterprise, Indian Collective, Black Business Investment Fund out of Florida and the Southeast, Enterprise Partners, and Genesis Fund, as well as Opportunity Finance itself, we then began testing what started out as these 3 principles and a checklist and became this assessment or tool as we now describe it. So what we did is tried not to create a screen, not something that was pass fail, but something that could be applied to every deal that came through the CDFI, whether it was a community facility or a business or a housing project, whatever it might be. And so what we did is, in that narrowing, put the tool, once it was developed and once it was being tested, against 11 different deals in the CDFI sector, as small as a $100,000 Black-owned business in Miami, up to a $20 million affordable housing project, and said, let's talk to the loan officers and the borrower developer and test it live, which is what we did. What was amazing is that in one of the very first tests, the loan officer, who loves this tool and uses it all the time now, said to the borrower, who was actually the developer of the affordable housing project, I want you to do these 5 things, because I can see that we could raise basements, we could do more permeable pavement around the building, setback could be more, we could put HVAC on the roof, we could have hookups for solar, battery, and generator. And the developer borrower said, okay. And he went and penciled it. It was slightly more expensive, but he agreed to the loan anyway, because you can imagine the reaction to some of this, right, from a developer borrower standpoint. And he did it. And then he said, you know what, I'm going to do this for every one of my projects going forward, because I can see that the cost is incremental, but the change, the resilience value return is huge for what that building could be, right? That was just one. And so it's incremental in the sense. So we did this testing, we brought it through, we got it through this phase. And where we started, however, after some massaging, as you can imagine, of the language, was a set of principles. And I'm not going to go detail by detail on the principles, but I will talk about what each of them is in the sense of like what it's called and what the keywords are. Those 3 principles became the foundation of the tool and the dashboards and open-ended questions that come under each of the principles. The first one is to ensure a resilience-based process in all endeavors. And here, new language for CDFIs, we want them to talk about shocks and stresses, and not so new language for CDFIs, we want them to talk about the stakeholders who are involved in the process. And even though that's traditional language for CDFIs, sometimes not enough due diligence was there, right? No surprise, stakeholder meetings are checkboxes in some cases. We did not want that, right? We've all seen that happen at a city level, at a community development level, at an engineering level, at a whatever level. A lot of checkboxes to get you through those steps. Idea here was that some kind of process was in place, stakeholders were talked to, shocks and stresses were discussed and examined. The second one was, and this is where it starts to feel like a normal loan or deal, but with this little layer of resilience on it, right? We were starting to sprinkle the fairy dust on. And that was, we're striving for reliable performance and intended outcomes in routine and extraordinary situations, right? This is where you start to talk about where and how you build differently and who's involved, see principle 1, and where that should happen, right? There, it's about the project, the performance, the outcomes, and the risk avoidance. But it's risk avoidance in ways that we've never talked about before. because risk at a CDFI, a bank, and lots of other institutions, including insurance, really deal with the average things, right? We were saying, let's go to the next step. And foreshadowing, principle 3 is what really made everyone uncomfortable, because then we were saying, let's look for co-benefits in addition to what we said we're like the loan officer did with that particular borrower, right? How do we take it to the next step? How do we create beneficial impacts to the community and the greater system and minimize negative effects and impacts? So we were asking questions in the dashboard and in the open-ended questions about interdependencies in the system and positive versus negative impacts that had never been asked before. Very uncomfortable conversations in some cases, even with just the loan officers, right? Let alone the borrowers who are like, why are you asking me about pollution? I want money to buy a food truck. Well, here's why, right? So we were really starting to mix that age-old community development kind of conversation and lending, financing, with that resilience co-benefits, resilience dividends, and that value, baking in the value. And as one of our cohort members said, I want our institution to normalize resilience, right? Everybody wrote that down. Holy crap. That's the phrase, right? And I use it all the time now, right? This was actually the woman who at the time was working for Indian Collective. She said, I want to normalize resilience. It should just be part of our underwriting. I paid her later for saying that, because that was exactly what we needed to hear from grassroots groups who are doing really hard work to begin with, and then adding resilience to it, right? So these are quick kind of screen grabs of what the dashboards look like. You'll laugh, I laugh now. I couldn't even use red, yellow, and green in the dashboard because it felt too screen-like to the CDFIs and the others who were giving input. So we ended up with 3 shades of green. Fine, right? But the idea is that we're asking a series of questions, a bit SDG-like, Sustainable Development Goal-like, where we're saying, how do we support this resilience principle? So under resilience principle 1, here's a couple of questions, right? Stakeholder engagement. Not at all, partially, significantly. That's all they had to answer in the dashboard form. And they could add notes to say, well, they did a survey for the community 10 years ago, and then they did some meetings a week ago, and blah, 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 blah. They could actually just fill it out like that if they wanted to. And a lot of the loan officers, because that's the kind of world they're used to, they were good with that style of doing it, right? Then you start to get deeper as you do the principles and you ask the questions like shocks and stresses. You can see that in question number 4, we are actually asking about biodiversity and interconnectedness of systems, natural as well as those that are man-made, and how are they preserved. That's kind of language that people aren't used to hearing about, an affordable housing project or a community facility. And what's the social, cultural, economic, environmental regeneration or respect even that this deal gives to that particular community, and how does it embed with system? So you'll see in some of the questions a very heavy equity focus, but also that sort of local, cultural, social lens with an equity kind of pointy tip of the spear, so that they weren't just doing deals. Right? They were asking questions about, should we even build here? What's the tradition here? What's the story? What's the history? Side note here, one of our, the CEO of Black Business Investment Fund, Inez Long, she did a twist on like this number 5 here in terms of how it reinvigorates cultural and social, because she wanted to use the tool. She wanted to then train Black contractors and empower them to do retrofits on housing that seemed like they weren't important because they were old shotgun shack style houses, but that they were culturally significant and that they wanted to learn how to save them and train them and fund them, funding and finance them and make them safe, right? So there was this whole, like, talk about like your brain exploding, right? She was adding to that layer to say, we need to do it this way as well with our Black contractors that we are going to fund. Joyce.
Stewart, I just wanted to say this is amazing, and I feel like we could actually have another hour with you presenting, but we have we want to be sure we get some questions in. So what I would ask is maybe we can do some discussion now, and maybe through the discussion, you'll be able to pull up some of your other slides. I have a couple of questions myself, but I'd love to turn it over to the group. And so maybe we could be sure that each response gets just a minute to make sure we have time for everything. And of course, please, if there's something that you want to close with, that would be great. And then we'll move over to questions.
Literally, that's fine, because I'm literally just showing parts of the dashboards with open-ended questions. So I wasn't even going to spend any time on it. And then this is just to let you know that there's a phase 2 potentially coming, and we can talk about that and the other things that are happening. So that could be kind of a little bit of the discussion. I'll leave this up for a bit, because the tool, without even trying, has now morphed itself as I've shared it with like utility boards and with other institutions and with my private work with Indian Collective, and changing it into a tool that's now being used on underwriting deals that I'm seeing as a loan off on the loan committee, right? So there's been movement, and it's kind of like DNA, right? There's just stuff that has gone out there, and I expect more of that. It's also coming back into Resilient Cities Network for the use on the Resilient Community Impact Fund and the measurements and things that we're going to use for that. So I was nearly done, and I am definitely open to just having a conversation.
Great. Well, I want to just say congratulations. I think all of us are gobsmacked. Like, this is something I've been looking for a long time. And so really bravo. And I'm sure it's been many sleepless nights, many wonderful partnerships. It's wonderful you bring it here to us. Can we have questions now? So you are welcome to raise your hand, but you're also welcome just to speak out. Anybody want to ask a question? I'm going to start with one. So, and then Adi, and then maybe there'll be some others in the line here. When you created this, and now that you're reflecting back on the 3 or 4 years of very intense work, do you think this is transferable to other financial mechanisms besides just CDFIs? Because the amounts you're talking about here are great, but the amount of assets under management are so much bigger, and it would be lovely if we could trigger others to do what you've done in other places.
Yep. So the direct answer is yes, and it's happened to some extent. It's happened, and I don't even know where, because I've been presenting to global financing networks. CCFLA is one of them. CFA is another one. And that in particular was done in order to get global DFIs and global financial institutions and impact investors looking at large scale versions of this. So absolutely, one of the conversations we had with the utility boards was, in fact, could they just take the tool and adapt it to their massive infrastructure deals that they were doing around energy, water, etc. Yes, I basically sent them the beta tool and said, go. We don't have time for that. In particular, though, because the RCI fund has been created and that model was there to kind of stimulate and incentivize local funders globally in whatever city or place we were working, including the United States, the idea is that we wouldn't be talking about $20 million. We'd be talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, and making sure that when we laid this lens over it, right, that it was still fitting. We were still seeing that normalizing of resilience. So absolutely is the answer to it. We picked CDFIs because it had such an equity focus, and we could sort of manage the cohort, if you will. We're hoping that in the second phase, as well as in the other work that I'm doing with the global DFIs, that it will advance. One last example, we are going to use the tool for what's called the investment protocol that we're opening up at the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon, and for a Africa Water Resilience Catalytic Fund, while we do a sidecar grant fund through the RCI fund, and use the tool for all of those, right? So these will be huge deals, but they will also be $50,000 to do like a mini bioswale for a community that changes the flooding aspect, right? Both and.
Love it. Love it. Okay, get your questions and comments going. I'm going to turn to Chris next, and then back to you, Adi. Chris.
Thanks, Stewart. This was really exciting to hear about, and I love CDFIs. I have kind of maybe a slight different question, which is CDFIs are so much less common in my neck of the woods, kind of the Intermountain West. I'm wondering if you can talk about any efforts to expand CDFIs to places where they haven't historically been located.
Yeah, there are ongoing CDFI fund and other efforts, including through Opportunity Finance Network, to do so. It's in fact why OFN continues to have these webinars. There's some coming up, as I said. I got pegged for a resilient and affordable housing webinar or session that's part of the larger day webinar, for instance. And this is all with the idea that not only are we adding resilience and making sure that we're thinking about this from climate, health, et cetera, but that we're also getting CDFIs where they're not. So there continues to be that training. Where are you located exactly, if you're comfortable saying?
Yeah, no, I'm in Montana, but we really work throughout the American West.
Okay, yeah, I mean, part of the, yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of native CDFIs in Montana. There are not as many non-native CDFIs. And then there's kind of a gap in Wyoming, Idaho, and parts of that broader Intermountain area. And I know, well, just because of the native work. So that is something we should definitely have a conversation about with Opportunity Finance Network or with others, because I do feel like there are blank spots on the map still, if we were to pinpoint. And some of it's about the type of lending too. You might not realize somebody's a housing CDFI and they're doing work all over Montana, but they won't touch any business loan fund stuff, right? And so we're always playing that. We're trying to figure out what the full measure is there.
So we have literally 3 minutes left. We have 2 good questions, I'm sure. So we'll do these in rapid fire. Adi and then Enrique, both of you ask your question, and then Stewart, you can answer them together. Adi first.
Right. So Stuart, out of all the different kinds of resilience, how much attention does resilience to climate change get? And is there need for and use of future climate projections in CDFI operations?
And then Enrique, just a sec. Stuart, let's get both questions. Enrique?
Sorry, forgot already.
Yeah, hi. So Climate Resolve is looking to promote climate resilience for acute shocks like extreme heat, which are growing more deadly. Our approach looks to do street and building interventions in order to reduce ambient temperatures, things like adding reflective coatings to streets and buildings. My question is, considering that CDFIs are loans, if a city was to apply to do, say, to pay for reflective coatings on private buildings, how would they go about repaying this loan if that endeavor is not generating revenue?
Great questions.
Yeah, great question. And I'll take that one first, just because it's very long and it has to do with where the cost savings are coming from. And so there's a whole conversation around CDFIs and cities or tribes or small towns and whose mechanism is the one that's being used. So in the case that you're giving, it could be that the CDFI could do the loan and the bank or landlord and a sort of landlord combination would allow for the payback. So there's a deal by deal, I would say, way of doing this. It's the same thing with solar, with energy retrofits, etc. So it can be done. It just depends on who the partners are and sort of where the levers get pulled. But that's a great question, because that's exactly the kind of way we figure out where the cost savings are coming from and how that pays back the loan. Adi, what did he ask?
Oh, I was asking for climate resilience. Is there?
Yeah. So yeah, and this is an easy one to answer. If you look at the definition of resilience we use, it's the combination of shocks and stresses, so that communities of any size and their systems can survive, adapt, and thrive, in particular the thrive part. So yes, climate, but it's also everything. And if you look at the framework we use, it's a very, very, very holistic view of resilience, adaptation, and mitigation together, which is why I use the word pre-recovery, because it's really anything that prevents us from being in recovery all the time.
Great. And Yangbu has given us so much insight into the chat. So Yangbu, a quick question and a quick answer from Stewart. Nice to see you.
Great, excellent. So really quickly here, Stewart, I was just putting up the point, and it ties in both the questions about the potential capture of savings and also the questions about what scale is necessary. And just recommending everyone here in this group to dive into the European Social Fund Plus as an example of something to build upon, because they actually have some mechanisms pretty well established for how these types of interventions, especially through loans, through various types of financing instruments, can actually be paid back, even if it's not generating revenue directly. So, and just in short, there's honestly no substitute for building whatever state capacity, state public sector innovation that's necessary here. That can't rely entirely on any one sector to pull this.
No, that's right. And let's be honest, the reason that CDFIs exist, and I can say this very bluntly, the reason CDFIs exist is because banks and other lending institutions didn't do what they needed to. And there was a history of all the stuff that we know about redlining and everything else. And government entities were not nimble enough and have the capacity to do that either. And so in between was this very big gap for communities in the United States, despite all the kind of forward thinking and movement of the United States. And I would just say that there are ways that this can be done, I think, in bringing these worlds together at the state level, at the city level, tribal level, etc. But this is a conversation that hadn't been happening until 3-4 years ago, right? And I would almost say that as far as we have been working on this and the pace we've been working, it still feels very nascent, and we've got a lot of room to grow.
Stewart, thank you so much. Honestly, rainbows and unicorns and everything great for your wonderful presentation. And as Stewart mentioned in his introduction, in spite of him being extremely generous with his time and always being willing to help the rest of us figure out all these great things, he actually also does run a firm. And so I do recommend that, you all look up Recovery Labs and think about including Stewart in your various important endeavors. So hopefully you can stay on for the next few minutes, Stewart, and join us for future meetings. This has been really illuminating. So the next part of our agenda here, we just have a few minutes, but we'd love to hear any great funding and finance work that you're either leading or aware of that has transpired in the last month, or that you have on your docket for the next 30 days or so. We're just, have a popcorn here. Feel free to just speak out. And of course, you can also put it in the chat. It's a great chance for us to see, what's really happening in this emerging element of our field, resilience funding and finance. Anybody?
I'll intervene again in case no one else. And not sure how many are aware of this, but the last couple of years been diving into a lot of what can be transposed and translated to the North American context in terms of public wealth trusts. For those of you not familiar, highly recommend any of the writings by Doug Getter and company with public wealth funds like Public Wealth of Cities, Public Wealth of Nations, and a whole bunch of working papers through Citi, BCG, Asian Development Bank, and a whole host of other entities. And actually, for those of you who are involved with GFOA, the Government to Finance Office Associations, they are actually actively seeking pilot projects and pilot grants for such initiatives they like to get off the ground, that in terms of putting public assets to highest best use, which you read Doug Getter's writings, roughly equivalent, if you just take public sector real assets, at least as much, if not double, that of US national GDP, just here in the States alone. So that's a potentially severely untapped source of funding to leverage.
Great. Thank you, Younggu. And if you want to put any of that in either the notes of the chat, we'd be thrilled. We just have a few minutes left for the whole meeting. So any other great ideas for people to think about for the next 30 days? Projects that you're working on. Okay. Well, it is a yin and a yang, a sin curve here, up and down. But there, I think, is a lot emerging. And the last time we met, we talked a lot about the Infrastructure Jobs Act and how much money that's going to bring as the NOFOs come out, the Notice of Funding Opportunities. So thank you, everybody. And feel free to continue to use the chat. So in our last few minutes here, we'd like to just double check on what we'd like to hear for our May meeting. Last time in this conversation, someone brilliantly suggested that we invite Stewart and hear more about his CDFI work, and you can see how that turned out. Fantastic. So does anyone want to suggest other things that you'd like to hear? And you can either use the chat or of course you can speak out here. And maybe Jonathan, can I just turn to you really quick for you to remind us of some of the topics that we'd heard from in the very initial days when we did an intake from everybody?
Yeah, some things that we're thinking about are finance-worthy metrics that Stuart went over today, how to attract ESG investors, develop financial incentives, how can local entities fund resilience projects, find matching funds, what kind of modeling metrics or risk considerations go into funding and finance or decision making, and then of course long-term organization, writing capacity, staff capacity, things like that. I think you're muted, Joyce.
So sorry, this group is only as good as our great ideas. So obviously a lot of those are coming in already, but please do think about what you'd like to hear next, because this is a really nice, intimate chance to get in touch with some really, interesting leaders that are doing really important things on resilience funding. All right. Just lastly, as Jonathan mentioned at the very start of our presentation here, just a sec, I'm trying to we are eager for folks to help out for future meetings in terms of note taking and leading in my role, facilitating the whole group, or certainly speaking, helping to create the agenda. And so there will be a meeting about that tomorrow. And maybe Brianna could put that. Let's see, is that in the agenda?
4 o'clock, Joyce.
4 Eastern time. Great. Yep. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to me or to Brianna or any of the other administrative type folks on the line. And unless there is anything else, I wanted to mention that we will see all of you again on the 23rd of May. Feel free to invite your friends. And we're really glad that this group has gotten off to such a robust start with Catherine and with all of our great input from the speakers that we've had recently. So thanks again, everybody. Have a great rest of your